Have you ever felt too insignificant for a great purpose? As if you didn't have what it takes to face the challenges of life? Interestingly, some of the greatest heroes in history started exactly like this: insecure, fearful, and full of doubts. One of them was Gideon. His story is one of the most surprising and, at the same time, one of the least expected in the Bible. He was not a king nor an experienced warrior. He had no power, not even confidence in himself. He was just an ordinary man, hiding, trying to survive in times of crisis. But what no one imagined was that God would choose him to lead one of the most improbable victories in the history of Israel. At that time, the people of Israel lived under the brutal oppression of the Midianites, an invading nation that not only stole their harvests but destroyed everything in its path. Year after year, the Israelites sowed, worked the land with effort and hope, only to watch as their enemies arrived in large hordes and ravaged everything, leaving hunger and despair behind. Fear took hold of the nation. Villages were emptied. Men and women hid in caves, afraid to step into the daylight. There were no armies to defend them, nor leaders with the courage to raise their voices. And in the middle of this crisis, in a small and insignificant village, one man worked in silence. Gideon wasn't on a battlefield, nor forging swords. He was hiding, threshing wheat inside a winepress, a place where grapes are usually crushed to make wine. He did it there out of fear that the Midianites would discover him and steal what little he had. But it was at that very moment, when he least expected it, that his life changed forever. A figure appeared beside him. It wasn't a soldier nor a messenger from the king. It was someone who radiated a different presence. With a firm yet calm voice, he looked at him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon froze. Mighty, him. A man who didn't even dare to thresh wheat in the open air. A man who had never wielded a sword in battle. How could God call him a warrior? What Gideon didn't know was that God saw in him something that even he couldn't recognize. And what seemed impossible was about to happen. Gideon couldn't believe what he had just heard. The words of the mysterious messenger echoed in his mind. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior? Nothing in his life justified such titles. He was the youngest in his family, and his clan was insignificant in the tribe of Manasseh. He didn't even consider himself a leader, let alone a deliverer of his people. But there was something different about that strange visitor. His words were not simply a greeting, they were a declaration about his destiny. The man speaking to him was not an ordinary human. He was an angel sent by God. And his message was clear. Gideon had been chosen to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. The story took place around 1200 BC, a time when Israel had no king. Instead, they were led by judges, leaders raised by God in times of crisis. However, the people had fallen into a destructive cycle. They forgot God, fell into idolatry, suffered invasions, cried out for help, and God sent them a deliverer. Gideon was about to become one of those judges. But he wasn't convinced. His mind was filled with questions. If God is with us, why are we suffering? Where are the miracles our ancestors told us about? Why has he abandoned us? The angel didn't answer with theological explanations. Instead, he gave him a direct command. Go with the strength you have and save Israel from the hands of the Midianites. Am I not sending you? Gideon felt a chill. How could he do this? He had no training, no army, no influence among his people. So, he asked for a sign. He prepared an offering of bread and meat and placed it on a rock. The angel touched the offering with his staff, and immediately, fire sprang from the rock, consuming it completely. At that moment, Gideon understood he wasn't imagining things. It wasn't a mere coincidence. God had truly chosen him. But his transformation wasn't immediate. He was still full of fear. That's why, when he received his first mission, to destroy the altar of Baal that his own father had set up in the village, he did it at night. He didn't want anyone to see him. The next day, the people woke up in shock. The altar was in ruins. Soon, they discovered that Gideon was responsible and demanded his death. But his father, Joash, challenged them with an unexpected response. If Baal is a god, let him defend himself. No one could answer. And so, Gideon not only survived but earned the respect of his community. However, this was just the beginning. He still had a long way to go. The real test was yet to come. Gideon had taken his first step in obedience, but he still wasn't fully convinced that God would back him up. Faith doesn't develop overnight, and he still struggled with insecurity. After the destruction of the altar of Baal, the news spread. People began to look at him differently. Some with admiration, others with suspicion. But there was a bigger problem on the horizon. The Midianites, along with their Amalekite allies and other peoples from the east, were preparing to attack again. Their camp spread like a plague across the Jezreel Valley, with thousands of soldiers ready to ravage whatever little remained in Israel. At this critical moment, something unexpected happened. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, summoning the men of Israel to the battle. Judges 6 verse 34. For the first time in his life, Gideon was no longer running away. He was calling Israel to battle. And the response was overwhelming. Thousands of men came to him, ready to defend their land and face their oppressors. However, deep inside, Gideon still had doubts. Even though he had seen the miracle of the fire consuming the offering and survived after destroying the pagan altar, he still feared that all of this might just be a coincidence. What if he was wrong? What if God wasn't really with him? So, he asked for another sign. He placed a fleece of wool on the ground and prayed, "Lord, if you are really going to save Israel through me, let the dew fall only on the fleece tonight, and let the ground be dry." The next morning, the fleece was completely soaked, but the ground around it was dry. Gideon should have been satisfied, but doubt persisted. Maybe it was a natural phenomenon. Maybe it wasn't enough. So he asked for another sign, but this time the reverse. "Lord, this time, let the fleece remain dry, while the ground is covered with dew." God, with patience, granted his request. When Gideon picked up the fleece in the morning, it was completely dry, while the ground around it was covered with dew. There were no more excuses. His faith, although fragile, now had tangible proof. The question was no longer whether God was with him, but whether he was willing to trust God completely. It was time to act. Gideon finally accepted his call. God had shown him undeniable signs that he was with him. Now, he had to lead Israel into battle against the Midianites. With 32,000 men at his disposal, confidence began to grow in the camp. Perhaps, after all, they had a chance at victory. However, God had other plans. "You have too many soldiers." God's words confused Gideon. Too many. The Midianites were an innumerable army, and every man in their ranks was vital. But God wasn't interested in numbers, but in purpose. He didn't want Israel to think that victory came from their own strength. So, Gideon received a difficult command. "Tell those who are afraid to go back home." Silence fell over the camp as the message spread. One by one, the men began to leave. In the end, 22,000 soldiers departed. Gideon was left with only 10,000 men. But God was not finished. There are still too many. This time, the selection would be even more specific. God ordered Gideon to take his men to the river and observe how they drank the water. Only those who took the water with their hands, without kneeling down completely, would be chosen. In the end, only 300 men were selected. For a human leader, this would have been a disaster. But Gideon, now with his faith strengthened, understood that the battle didn't depend on numbers or conventional strategies. It depended on God. When night fell, instead of arming them with swords and spears, Gideon gave them trumpets, torches, and clay jars. There would be no direct confrontation, but a strategy based on chaos and fear. In the darkness, the 300 men surrounded the enemy camp. In an instant, they broke their jars, lifted their torches, and blew their trumpets loudly. The noise and lights created a terrifying illusion. The Midianites, confused and terrified, began to fight each other. Israel won the battle without even lifting a sword. Here the difference between human action and divine intervention was clear. No army reduced to 300 men could have achieved such a feat without God's backing. Gideon had done his part, obeying, trusting, and acting. But ultimately, the victory did not depend on his effort, but on the absolute power of the Lord. Israel was not only liberated, but it also learned a crucial lesson. When God fights the battle, even the impossible becomes reality. Gideon's victory over the Midianites brought peace to Israel. For the first time in years, the people could live without fear, cultivate their lands, and rebuild their villages without the threat of invaders. Gideon's name became a symbol of courage and faith, and people began to see him not only as a military leader but as the man God had chosen to save them. However, the story of Israel was marked by a dangerous pattern. Every time they experienced deliverance, they turned away from God. The people were so grateful to Gideon that they made him a surprising proposal. "Be our king. Reign over us, you, your children, and your children's children." But Gideon knew that true authority should not rest on him. His answer was firm. "I will not be your king, nor will my son. The Lord is the one who should rule over you." Despite rejecting the throne, Gideon made a mistake that would change the fate of Israel. He asked each man for a gold earring taken from the war spoils, and with that gold, he made an ephod, a type of sacred garment that in ancient times represented the presence of God. His intention wasn't bad. Perhaps he wanted to create a reminder of the divine victory. But what started as a symbol of faith became an object of worship. Over time, the people began to venerate the ephod instead of God. They treated it as a talisman, believing it had power in itself. And so, once again, Israel fell into the trap of idolatry. After Gideon's death, the situation worsened. Without his leadership, the people quickly forgot God and returned to worshiping the false gods of the surrounding nations. The lesson was clear: when faith is not anchored in God, something else will always take its place. Israel had witnessed miracles, but human nature is fragile. Idolatry doesn't always begin with large statues or strange rituals. Often, it starts with something small, a subtle deviation that slowly leads people away from the truth. The story of Gideon was not only a tale of victory but also a warning. Even the greatest heroes can, unwittingly, be the cause of their own people's downfall. This story is a reflection of human nature and its contradictions. A man who went from doubt to faith, from insecurity to victory, but whose legacy was also marked by the mistakes and fragility of his people. God took someone who didn't believe he was capable and turned him into a leader. Not because Gideon was the strongest or the wisest, but because he was willing to obey. Through him, God showed that victory does not depend on numbers, human strategies, or personal power, but on trusting in his guidance. However, the story didn't end in triumph. Idolatry returned, and with it, the same cycle of decay that had condemned Israel so many times. Despite having seen God's hand at work, the people turned away again, showing that miracles alone do not transform hearts if there is no true commitment to faith. The message is clear: true strength is not in victory over external enemies, but in the ability to remain faithful to God even when everything seems to be going well. The story of Gideon leaves us with a question: what do we do after receiving a blessing? Do we cling to God, or do we give in to self-sufficiency and forgetfulness? If this story has impacted you, don't forget to like, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and transform. See you in the next video. May God bless you today and always.